Welcome to episode 1 of our Portfolio Playbook series. If you have been feeling at all lost or overwhelmed when it comes to building a portfolio project that actually stands out in the job hunt, then this interactive series is for you. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how to initialize and set up the first steps of your portfolio project. We're going to be talking through questions like, how do I even find realistic data that has business relevance? How do I think about what tools to use and how to tie them all together? And most importantly, how do I define the scope of my project and define a goal that is going to be relevant to a real company? At the end, I'm going to leave you with concrete steps so that you'll have a data set that you're ready to work with, and you also have an understanding of what you're going to focus your project on. And then we're going to lead into my next video, which is going to be a step-by-step framework for actual data cleaning. If you're new here, I'm Christine. I'm a former data hiring manager and also a data mentor and founder of the Analytics Accelerator program. And in this series, I'm going to be teaching you how to build a job-ready project that follows the READY framework that we talked about in the last video. Let's dive in. As a reminder, the READY framework stands for Representative Data, Exec-Driven Questions, Analytical Frameworks, Data Best Practices, and also your impact and your insights. So today we're going to focus on the R of the READY framework. Now, it's a really common saying to hear garbage in, garbage out when it comes to the actual quality of your data and how that relates to the quality of your analysis. It's really similar when it comes to the business relevance of your projects. The more business relevant your actual data is, the more business relevant your insights and your recommendations will naturally be. So this is a really important step to spend time on and be really intentional about when you're setting up your project. So don't waste time on data that is too personal or too niche. For example, video game stats or US Open stats or your personal stats about marathon training or your sleep quality. Even though that data is readily available, just remember that that data is better used for learning projects. And also don't use data sets that are too generic or too commonplace. So that's things like the Airbnb dataset, the Iowa liquor sales dataset, the Tableau Superstore dataset, or bike sharing data. That's just way too generic when it comes to standing out in the job market today. You want to strike a balance between data that is broad enough to apply to the variety of industries that you're interested in, but are also still specific and rigorous enough to represent the real job. Now, I know this is really tricky, and so we're going to talk about how to do that. So let's think about the data sets that we actually encounter at work. Many businesses will care about these categories: financial data, marketing data, customer and user data, and product data. Now, of course, these categories are going to be different if you're thinking about nonprofits or healthcare, but in general, most companies will have some version of these categories that they care about. Every company wants to know how much money they're earning, where the money came from, who's spending that money, and what pushes them to do so. So find a few job descriptions that are ideally the kinds of jobs that you'd apply to, and look at the teams and the data sets and the different kinds of metrics that they explain in that job description, because that will give you a clue as to what kind of data sets they want you to have experience with. One of the things to focus on first is the actual volume of the data set. Ideally, you would have a data set that is at least 50K records, because usually as analysts, we would be working with data sets of at least a few thousand records. Then you also want to pay attention to two main categories. One are the actual metrics in the data set. Does the data set have common industry metrics and quantitative values that you can work with? And then on the flip side of metrics, of course, you want to have business relevant dimensions. So these are the qualitative or categorical variables that you can then slice and dice these metrics by. The more dimensions you have and the more metrics you have, the more in-depth your analysis will be able to go. So for example, if you want to be a marketing analyst, the perfect kind of data set would have marketing metrics and marketing dimensions. For example, total traffic, page views, click-through rates, email open rates, and dimensions like customer demographics. So which region the customer lives in, maybe their gender, maybe something else about their profile or whether or not they even have an account. And you usually want to have the element of time within this data set. It's one of the most important dimensions that data analysts work with, because most of the time we're working with historical information and trying to tell the story of what happened. Okay, so now let's talk about the biggest question when it comes to the R step of the READY framework, which is, how do I actually find this data? Now, there's three main categories that I want you guys to think about. The first one is looking at publicly available datasets. So this includes things like Kaggle or datasets that are published by governments or by companies themselves or different organizations like nonprofits. This category tends to be the lowest quality in terms of their business relevance and most of the time in terms of their volume as well. But I recommend not really focusing on this category of data sources and focusing a little bit more on category 2 or 3. The second category is tapping into your secondary network or anyone who owns a small business or works at a small business and has access to this data that you can also get access to. For example, a friend who runs an Etsy shop and maybe has transactional data, or maybe someone who has a YouTube channel and has access to YouTube analytics data. There is so much marketing and social media data that YouTube actually collects for you that if you can get your hands on that, that's actually an awesome data set to focus on. The third category is the best category, and this is data that comes directly from volunteering experiences, internships, fellowships, or a paid work opportunity or contract work. Now, of course, in this area, you have to be careful about whether or not this data can actually be shared. Usually volunteering opportunities or contract work are okay with you actually sharing that data publicly. But with past roles or internships, you'd have to ask for permission or heavily anonymize the data and do that translation, maybe using something like ChatGPT so that the company's information is protected. Now, I know this takes a lot of time and effort, but it is worth the energy because if you can find a really business relevant data set, it will make the rest of your project so much more relevant to real companies. In one of my other videos, I talk about how during my year off of work, I actually worked with a thrift store owner to do some analytics and seasonality analysis on her sales, her profits, and what categories of inventory were doing well. So that's the kind of thinking that you want to lean towards if you're having trouble finding a public data set that you think would be good for a project. So the ideal data set looks something like this. You can see that I have time as a dimension and a number of different business metrics and dimensions that I know I can slice and dice those metrics by, which means that there's going to be lots for me to explore and lots of insights for me to surface. There's about 100,000 records in this data set, and I can see that there are inconsistencies in the data that I'm going to have to take care of as an analyst, which is actually a good thing because I want nulls, I want outliers, I want nonsensical data and miscategorized data so that I can actually exercise some hands-on data cleaning. Now, this data set is a blend of a bunch of different data sets that have been anonymized and also blended with my own manual manipulation in ChatGPT and directly in Excel to replicate the kind of realistic trends that I've seen across the different industries that I've worked in. In the next video, I will include a downloadable sample of this data set so that you can follow along with this data set in this series if you don't find another data set that you want to work with. So picking and finding your data set is, of course, one of the most important part of the setup. Now, what is the other half of the setup? That is defining the scope of your project. I think we all know too well the experience of getting really lost in analysis paralysis when you're starting a project, not really knowing all the different directions that your analysis can take, and also just feeling like you're rabbit holing into a bunch of different formulas, looking up on Stack Overflow and Reddit and trying to troubleshoot. And a lot of times that happens because the project scope is too broad or undefined. So how do we overcome this? We can narrow in on the scope of a project by defining a few exec-driven questions that represent the kind of questions that a high-level stakeholder would ask at a company. Now, why do I say exec-driven questions? All of that means is that the question is broad enough in that there's a lot of analysis to do, and it's not so specific that it can just be answered with a dead-end value. For example, if a marketing manager just wanted to know what were the click-through rates of 2025 across all months. That's something that can just be answered with one table, right? There's not a lot of analysis to do there. So having an exec-driven question, for example, a question that would be asked by the head of finance or the head of marketing or the head of product, leaves a lot of room to actually do deep analysis while also going broad enough to apply to a variety of different industries. It's a bit of an art and a science here where you don't want to undershoot or overshoot the scope of the project. Right now, we're just going to focus on what are the questions that you want to ask that define the goal of this project. So here are some examples of some good business questions to get you thinking. What were the monthly overall trends during a certain time period or across a certain category? What were the yearly growth rates across a certain dimension? Or ask a question that really drills into a certain dimension. For example, which products perform the best and worst across a certain period of time? Or which countries or states should the company focus more on if they want to push a certain product to the forefront? Now, this is where you can use ChatGPT to help you brainstorm, where you can give it some information about the data set that you have and ask it to come up with a few exec level questions and what kind of stakeholders would be asking that question. I know it can be a little bit tricky, especially if you haven't had corporate work experience before, to know the kinds of questions that people are getting at work. So this is where AI can definitely be our thought partner, and you can also reverse engineer this a bit by feeding in the job descriptions and ask it to ask you, what are the kinds of questions that a data analyst might encounter in this position? In this series, we're going to work on questions that have to do with overall trends and growth rates, which is a concept that all data analysts should be familiar with. My last tip here is to bring the company context in even more by thinking about the actual use case of this project in the context of a company. So for example, you could position it as this project is actually going to be used for a town hall, where the deliverable is a presentation or it's analysis that will be translated to certain slides. Or you could position it as an analysis that is going to be delivered directly to the executive stakeholder, where they're going to want to see an actual report and a write-up with your insights and findings. And then, of course, you have to pick the actual tools that you're going to be working with. A lot of times, data analysts will just pick one singular tool for each project. So, for example, they'll have a SQL project, and then they'll have an Excel project, and then they'll have a Python project. This is actually a lost opportunity to show that you know how to use the tools as a cohesive system. And you need to actually learn how to do this through your projects if you don't have that kind of experience at work. So my recommendation here is if you're an early career data analyst or you're transitioning into analytics, you definitely need a project that shows a combination of Excel and SQL. So you can start out there where you're doing your analysis and visualization in Excel and then doing more advanced querying in SQL. If you're a little bit higher level in your career, you've already been working as an analyst for 1 to 2 years, and you just want to have a project to be able to prove your experience to a hiring manager, then you can focus on some of the more advanced skills like Python and maybe tie in a dashboarding tool like Tableau. More importantly, you want to be able to align the tools that you're using to the jobs that you want to be applying to. Number one, first make sure that you're applying to the jobs that are at the right level for you. Check out my other job hunt videos for more information about this. And then start reverse engineering what are the most applicable tools for you to use in this project. For early career data analysts, it's always going to be SQL as the foundation, and then either Excel or a dashboarding tool. Ultimately, it is not going to be about choosing the fanciest tool or the most advanced approach. It's always going to be about demonstrating your ability to use these tools in a practical way to surface something that's meaningful to other people. For this series, we're going to be touching on a bunch of these tools, and I will show you how to tie them all together. So make sure to follow along if this is something that you want to learn how to do. This is just the beginning of the Ready framework. In the next few weeks, we're going to be diving way more into the analytical frameworks, how to bring professional polish, and how to package this kind of project all together. As I mentioned, this is an interactive series, and so my question to you guys this week is, what is it about the data cleaning process that you find most confusing or you specifically want to understand better? Leave me a comment below sooner rather than later, because I'm going to film this one in the next week or so. And if you are ready to take your projects to the next level and become a data analyst this year, check out my program below, which is now open for applications, and I will see you guys in the next video.